The marriage certificate discovered in the basement of the abandoned courthouse in Harlan County, Kentucky, bore 3 signatures, all belonging to the same woman who had somehow managed to legally marry her own father, while simultaneously serving as mother to his children and daughter in his household. When genealogist Rebecca Torres uncovered this document in 2021, she realized she had stumbled upon the most psychologically twisted family arrangement in Appalachian history, where one woman had been systematically conditioned to fulfill every possible female role in a single man's life. This is the story of how isolation, manipulation, and generational trauma created a family structure so disturbing that it challenges our basic understanding of human relationships and the boundaries that separate different forms of love. The musty scent of decaying paper filled the courthouse basement as Rebecca Torres photographed document after document in the forgotten archives of Harlan County, while the steady drip of water through cracked foundation stones created a rhythm that seemed to echo the methodical way she was uncovering secrets that had been buried for over 70 years. Her cotton gloves caught on the brittle edges of marriage licenses and birth certificates that told stories no family should have lived and no community should have ignored. Rebecca had been hired by the Kentucky Historical Society to digitize records before the old courthouse was demolished, but what she discovered in those moldering files would consume the next 2 years of her life and reveal how deeply psychological abuse could warp human relationships when it occurred across multiple generations. The first document that caught her attention was a marriage license dated June 15, 1943, uniting Jacob Whitmore, age 47, with Mary Elizabeth Whitmore, age 19. The shared surname suggested they were relatives, but the age gap and formal legal language indicated this was a legitimate marriage rather than simply a clerical error or family joke. What made the document truly disturbing was the witness signature. Mary Elizabeth Whitmore appeared twice on the same certificate, once as the bride and once as a witness to her own wedding. No adult woman would witness her own marriage unless there was something fundamentally wrong with either the ceremony or the family dynamics that made such an arrangement necessary. Rebecca's investigation into the Whitmore family records revealed a pattern of documentation that suggested Mary Elizabeth had occupied multiple official roles within the same household across several decades. She appeared on census records as Jacob's daughter from 1924 to 1942, as his wife from 1943 to 1961, and as the mother of children whose birth certificates listed Jacob as the father. The medical records discovered in a separate cache of documents revealed that Mary Elizabeth had given birth to 6 children between 1944 and 1956, all of whom were genetically Jacob's children, but legally existed in an impossible family structure where their mother was simultaneously their sister, their father was also their grandfather, and their household contained relationships that violated both legal definitions and biological reality. Dr. Samuel Hayes, the family physician who had delivered 5 of the 6 children, had maintained private medical files that documented his growing concern about the psychological and genetic implications of the Whitmore family's unusual arrangements. His notes, written in medical terminology that disguised their explosive implications, revealed his attempts to understand how such relationships had developed and whether intervention was possible. July 12th, 1947. Patient Mary Elizabeth continues to exhibit signs of severe psychological conditioning that prevents normal social development. Her understanding of family relationships appears fundamentally distorted, suggesting systematic manipulation from early childhood. Recommend evaluation by psychiatric specialists, though patient unlikely to cooperate due to extreme dependency on male authority figure. The psychological conditioning that Dr. Hayes documented had begun when Mary Elizabeth was approximately 8 years old, following the death of her mother in a mining accident that left Jacob as her sole guardian. What should have been a normal father-daughter relationship had gradually transformed into something that incorporated elements of romantic partnership, domestic servitude, and maternal dependency in ways that violated every boundary that typically separates different types of human relationships. Jacob had systematically isolated Mary Elizabeth from outside influences that might have provided perspective on normal family structures or challenged the arrangements he was implementing. She had never attended school, never formed friendships outside the household, and never been exposed to religious or social influences that might have questioned the evolution of her relationship with her father. By the time she reached adolescence, Mary Elizabeth had been conditioned to believe that her primary purpose in life was to fulfill whatever role Jacob needed her to play, whether that meant serving as his daughter when he needed paternal authority, his romantic partner when he desired companionship, or his domestic helper when household management was required. The conditioning process had been so thorough that Mary Elizabeth apparently saw no contradiction in simultaneously occupying roles that were mutually exclusive in normal family structures. She had been taught that love meant complete submission to Jacob's needs and that questioning those needs represented betrayal of their special relationship. Family corrupts everything. The community's response to the Whitmore family situation demonstrated the complex social dynamics that governed mountain communities in the 1940s, where geographic isolation and economic interdependence made direct confrontation of family situations both practically difficult and potentially dangerous for anyone who challenged established power structures. Neighbors certainly suspected that Jacob and Mary Elizabeth's relationship extended beyond normal father-daughter boundaries, but the combination of economic dependency, cultural traditions about family privacy, and fear of Jacob's reputation for violence made intervention unlikely. Jacob owned the local general store and controlled access to supplies that mountain families needed for survival, giving him economic leverage over anyone who might criticize his domestic arrangements. What would you do if you suspected that a child in your community was being systematically abused and conditioned by her own father? But challenging that situation might result in economic retaliation that could threaten your family's access to essential supplies and services? The people of Harlan County chose silence, creating a conspiracy of willful blindness that allowed Jacob's psychological manipulation to continue unchallenged for decades. But the community's silence came with costs that extended beyond moral compromise. The children born to Jacob and Mary Elizabeth would inherit not just genetic damage from their incestuous parentage, but psychological trauma from growing up in a family structure where normal relationship boundaries had been completely eliminated and where their mother's multiple roles created confusion about identity, authority, and appropriate behavior. Rebecca Torres understood that she had uncovered evidence of the most systematic psychological abuse case in Kentucky's recorded history, involving a man who had successfully transformed his own daughter into a wife and mother, while maintaining complete control over every aspect of her existence. The documentation revealed a form of family dysfunction so complete that it challenged basic assumptions about human relationships and parental responsibility. But her investigation was about to reveal that Mary Elizabeth's situation was just one example of a broader pattern of psychological manipulation that had affected multiple generations of the Whitmore family, creating a legacy of trauma that would continue influencing descendants for decades after the original abuse had ended. Before we dive deeper into this twisted family dynamic, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. Drop a comment below. If this story is as disturbing as I think it is, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe, because the psychological manipulation we're about to uncover gets even more complex and horrifying. The diary entries found hidden beneath floorboards in Mary Elizabeth's childhood bedroom revealed how Jacob Whitmore had systematically destroyed his daughter's ability to distinguish between paternal love and romantic manipulation, using techniques that child psychologists now recognize as sophisticated psychological grooming that prepared her to accept increasingly inappropriate relationships as normal expressions of family affection. The diary's pages, written in a child's careful handwriting between the ages of 10 and 16, documented the gradual erosion of healthy boundaries until Mary Elizabeth could no longer recognize that what was happening to her constituted abuse rather than special love. This wasn't just parental neglect or inappropriate behavior. This was evidence of deliberate psychological conditioning designed to transform a child into the perfect victim who would never resist, never question, and never seek help from the outside world. The creaking of old wooden stairs echoed through the abandoned Whitmore house as Rebecca Torres climbed to the second floor, while the musty smell of decades-old wallpaper mixed with the lingering scent of coal smoke that had permeated every surface during the house's occupied years. Her flashlight beam revealed a child's bedroom that had been preserved exactly as Mary Elizabeth had left it in 1943, complete with toys, books, and personal belongings that told the story of a childhood that had been systematically corrupted by the adult who should have protected her. The diary had been hidden beneath loose floorboards under Mary Elizabeth's bed, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from moisture and decay. The entries began when she was 10 years old, written in the careful penmanship that mountain schools had taught, before Jacob withdrew her from formal education to begin what he called her special training for adult responsibilities. The early entries read like typical childhood observations about daily life, family activities, and the normal concerns of a young girl growing up in an isolated mountain community. But even these innocent passages contained hints of the psychological manipulation that was already beginning to shape Mary Elizabeth's understanding of her relationship with her father. October 3rd, 1932. Daddy says I'm getting too old for regular school, and that he needs to teach me special things that other children don't need to know. He says I'm more important to our family than other girls are to theirs, and that makes me special. I like being special. Jacob had begun the conditioning process by convincing Mary Elizabeth that their relationship was unique and superior to normal parent-child bonds, creating a sense of privilege and specialness that made her eager to participate in whatever he had planned for her future. This initial manipulation established the psychological foundation for more serious abuse by making Mary Elizabeth feel chosen rather than victimized. The diary entries from ages 11 and 12 documented the gradual introduction of inappropriate physical contact disguised as affection, education, or preparation for adult responsibilities. Jacob had been careful to normalize each boundary violation before introducing the next one, ensuring that Mary Elizabeth never experienced a dramatic shift that might trigger resistance or recognition that something was wrong. December 15th, 1933. Daddy has been teaching me about how women need to take care of men's needs. He says most girls learn this from their mothers, but since Mama died, he has to teach me himself. The lessons are private, and I'm not supposed to talk about them with anyone because other people wouldn't understand how special our family is. The secrecy that Jacob imposed around his educational activities served multiple purposes. It prevented Mary Elizabeth from seeking outside perspective that might challenge his version of normal behavior. It made her complicit in maintaining the family's isolation, and it established patterns of deception that would make it difficult for her to seek help, even if she eventually recognized that abuse was occurring. By age 13, Mary Elizabeth's diary entries revealed complete acceptance of her father's authority and his explanations for their increasingly inappropriate relationship. She had been conditioned to interpret any discomfort or confusion she felt as evidence of her own immaturity, rather than recognition that Jacob's behavior was harmful and wrong. May 20th, 1935. Sometimes the lessons make me feel strange, but Daddy says that means I'm learning important things about being a woman. He says the strange feelings are good, and that they mean, I'm becoming the kind of daughter who can take care of her family properly. I want to be good at taking care of Daddy. The psychological techniques Jacob used to maintain control over Mary Elizabeth were sophisticated for someone without formal training in manipulation or abuse. He had developed strategies that incorporated elements of religious justification, practical necessity, and emotional dependency to create a belief system that portrayed their relationship as both morally appropriate and practically necessary. Jacob convinced Mary Elizabeth that their special relationship was blessed by God and that normal social rules didn't apply to families who had been chosen for higher purposes. He used selective biblical references to justify his behavior while ignoring religious teachings about appropriate family relationships and the protection of children from adult exploitation. He also created practical justifications by emphasizing their economic isolation and mutual dependency, arguing that their survival required Mary Elizabeth to assume adult responsibilities that other children weren't mature enough to handle. This framing made their inappropriate relationship seem necessary rather than abusive, practical rather than perverted. Love becomes possession. The diary entries from Mary Elizabeth's teenage years revealed the complete success of Jacob's psychological conditioning. By age 16, she had internalized his explanations for their relationship so completely that she couldn't imagine any other way of living or any other form of family structure that would be as fulfilling as the one they had created together. August 7th, 1938. Daddy says we'll be getting married soon so that I can officially be his wife as well as his daughter. I'm excited because it means our special relationship will be recognized by law and nobody will be able to interfere with our family anymore. I love Daddy more than anything and I want to make him happy forever. The anticipation Mary Elizabeth expressed about marrying her father demonstrated how completely she had been conditioned to accept the most fundamentally wrong relationship as not just normal, but desirable. She had been systematically taught to value Jacob's happiness over her own welfare and to define her worth entirely through her ability to fulfill his needs and desires. The psychological damage, documented in Mary Elizabeth's diary, extended beyond simple acceptance of abuse to include the complete elimination of her ability to form independent thoughts, desires, or relationships that didn't center on Jacob's authority and approval. She had been transformed from an autonomous individual into an extension of his will and desires. But the diary also revealed something that would make Mary Elizabeth's situation even more tragic. Evidence that she possessed intelligence, creativity, and emotional depth that could have flourished under normal circumstances. Her writing showed sophisticated understanding of complex emotions and relationships, suggesting that Jacob had deliberately stunted the development of someone who might have achieved remarkable things if she had been allowed to grow up in a healthy environment. The conditioning process Jacob had used to transform Mary Elizabeth from daughter to wife had required years of systematic psychological manipulation that violated every principle of healthy child development. He had essentially murdered the person she might have become and replaced her with a psychologically crippled victim whose entire identity revolved around meeting his needs. The final diary entry, written 2 weeks before her marriage to Jacob, revealed the complete success of his psychological programming, while also hinting at the profound tragedy of what had been lost in the process of creating his perfect victim. May 30th, 1943. Tomorrow I put away childish things forever and become Daddy's wife officially. I know I should be happy, but sometimes I have dreams about a different life, where I went to school and had friends and maybe married someone else. But those are just silly dreams. My real life is here with Daddy, taking care of him and making sure he's never lonely or sad. That's what love means. The dreams Mary Elizabeth described represented the last vestiges of the autonomous person she might have become, surfacing briefly before being buried forever under the weight of psychological conditioning that had transformed natural development into systematic victimization. But Rebecca Torres's investigation was about to reveal that Mary Elizabeth's transformation was just the beginning of Jacob's long-term plan for their family, and that the children born to their incestuous marriage would inherit not just genetic damage, but a family structure designed to perpetuate the same psychological manipulation across multiple generations. The school enrollment records discovered in the Harlan County Board of Education files showed a pattern that made the clerk's hands shake as she photocopied each document. The Whitmore children had been registered, with Mary Elizabeth listed alternately as their mother, their sister, and their guardian, depending on which identity served Jacob's purposes at any given time. When 8-year-old Sarah Whitmore was asked by her teacher to draw her family tree in 1952, she submitted a drawing that showed herself connected to the same man through 3 different relationship lines, creating a genealogical impossibility that no child should have been capable of conceiving, let alone accepting, as normal. This wasn't just family dysfunction. This was evidence of how psychological manipulation could become hereditary, passed from one generation to the next, through children who were born into impossibility and raised to believe that chaos was the natural order of human relationships. The sound of children's voices echoed through the empty hallways of the abandoned Harlan County Elementary School as Rebecca Torres examined enrollment files that had been stored in the principal's office since the school's closure in 1987, while the smell of chalk, dust, and old textbooks mixed with the musty odor of papers that had been yellowing for decades. Her photocopier hummed steadily as she documented evidence of an educational system's struggle to categorize children whose family structure defied every administrative form and legal definition. The Whitmore children had presented unique challenges to school officials who were equipped to handle normal family situations, but completely unprepared for students whose mother was also their sister and whose father was simultaneously their grandfather. The confusion extended beyond simple paperwork problems to include fundamental questions about legal guardianship, emergency contacts, and parental consent that had no clear answers when applied to Jacob's twisted family arrangement. Sarah Whitmore, born in 1944 as the first child of the Jacob-Mary Elizabeth union, had entered first grade in 1950, with enrollment documents that listed Mary Elizabeth as her mother. But when disciplinary issues arose later that year, school officials discovered that Mary Elizabeth consistently deferred all decisions to Jacob, referring to him as Daddy, in ways that suggested she was seeking parental approval rather than consulting with her husband about their mutual child. The teacher's notes from Sarah's first grade year revealed the extent to which the Whitmore children's home environment had prepared them for confusion rather than clarity about human relationships and social expectations. November 15th, 1950. Sarah continues to exhibit unusual behavior during family discussions. When asked about her parents, she sometimes refers to Mama Mary and Daddy Jacob, but other times calls them Sister Mary and Granddaddy Jacob. She appears genuinely confused about these relationships rather than deliberately deceptive. Recommend psychological evaluation to determine source of family role confusion. The psychological evaluation was never conducted because Jacob refused to provide consent for any outside assessment of his children's mental health or family situation. He claimed that school officials were interfering with his religious beliefs and constitutional rights to raise his children according to his own values and traditions. The pattern of role confusion documented in Sarah's school records became even more pronounced with the younger Whitmore children who had been born into an established system of psychological manipulation rather than experiencing the gradual transition that Sarah had witnessed during her early years. By the time Jacob Jr. was born in 1947, the family's twisted dynamics had become so normalized that the children accepted impossibility as routine rather than recognizing anything unusual about their circumstances. Rebecca discovered that each Whitmore child had developed different coping strategies for managing the cognitive dissonance created by their impossible family structure. Some had simply accepted the contradictions without attempting to resolve them, while others had created elaborate mental systems that allowed them to categorize different versions of the same relationships, depending on context and social expectations. 10-year-old Martha Whitmore had explained to her teacher in 1955 that she had two different mamas, one who lived in their house and took care of daily needs, and another who existed only during official occasions, when Mary Elizabeth needed to present herself as an adult authority figure, rather than Jacob's daughter. Martha's ability to maintain this dual understanding suggested sophisticated psychological adaptation to fundamentally abnormal circumstances. The children's confusion extended beyond family relationships to include basic concepts about authority, identity, and social expectations that most children absorb naturally through normal family interactions. They had been raised in an environment where the most fundamental categories of human experience, parent and child, husband and wife, brother and sister, were fluid rather than fixed, creating psychological instability that affected their ability to form normal relationships outside the family unit. School records showed that all 6 Whitmore children had difficulty forming friendships with classmates, not because of social anxiety or developmental delays, but because they couldn't understand or relate to families where parents and children occupied distinct roles and maintained appropriate boundaries. They found normal family structures confusing and artificial, having been conditioned to believe that healthy relationships were less authentic than the psychological chaos they experienced at home. March 2020, 1954. Jacob Jr. asked me today why other children's mothers don't also serve as their sisters. When I explained that mothers and sisters are different relationships, he became agitated and insisted that I was wrong about how families work. He appears to believe that his family structure is normal and that other families are defective or incomplete. Children learn what they live. The educational challenges presented by the Whitmore children extended beyond family role confusion to include fundamental problems with concepts of truth, authority, and social reality. They had been raised in an environment where lies were presented as truth and where impossible situations were treated as normal, creating cognitive frameworks that made conventional learning extremely difficult. Teachers reported that Whitmore children would confidently provide factually incorrect information about topics ranging from basic biology to social studies, not because they hadn't learned the material, but because they had been taught alternative versions of reality that contradicted standard educational content. When corrected, they would become confused and defensive, unable to understand why their family's version of truth was being challenged. The children's academic performance suffered not because of intellectual deficits, but because they had been systematically taught to distrust outside sources of information that conflicted with Jacob's teachings. They had been conditioned to believe that their family possessed special knowledge that other people couldn't understand, making them resistant to educational experiences that challenged their fundamental assumptions about reality. But the most disturbing aspect of the children's school experiences wasn't their academic struggles. It was evidence that they were beginning to reproduce their parents' psychological manipulation in their interactions with classmates and younger students. Several teachers reported incidents where Whitmore children had attempted to establish inappropriate relationships with peers, using manipulation techniques that mirrored Jacob's approach to controlling Mary Elizabeth. 12-year-old Samuel Whitmore had been disciplined multiple times for attempting to establish special relationships with younger female classmates that involved secrecy, isolation, and inappropriate physical contact. When questioned about his behavior, he had explained that he was teaching them about being special in ways that echoed Jacob's language about Mary Elizabeth's unique status within their family. The school's response to these incidents revealed the same pattern of willful blindness that had allowed Jacob's original abuse to continue unchallenged. Rather than investigating the source of Samuel's inappropriate behavior or recognizing it as evidence of systematic family dysfunction, school officials had simply punished the individual incidents while ignoring the broader pattern that suggested serious problems in the Whitmore household. The children were beginning to perpetuate the cycle of abuse that had created them, carrying forward psychological manipulation techniques they had learned through observation and direct training. They were becoming the next generation of abusers, prepared to inflict the same damage on future victims that had been inflicted on their mother and themselves. Rebecca Torres realized that she was documenting not just individual family dysfunction, but evidence of how psychological abuse could become hereditary, transmitted from one generation to the next, through children who had been systematically taught that manipulation was love and that confusion was the natural state of human relationships. But her investigation was about to reveal something even more disturbing, evidence that Jacob had been deliberately training his children to identify and recruit future victims for his expanding network of psychological manipulation, turning his family into a predatory organization that targeted other vulnerable individuals throughout the mountain community. The Social Services report filed in 1958 documented a pattern that made investigator Helen Morrison's stomach turn as she read through case files. The Whitmore family had been fostering young girls from troubled backgrounds for over a decade, but none of these children had ever been returned to their original families or successfully placed in permanent homes. When Morrison tracked down the paperwork for 12 different foster placements, she discovered that each girl had simply vanished from official records after being placed with Jacob Whitmore, becoming invisible additions to a household that was systematically expanding its network of psychological manipulation and abuse. This wasn't just family dysfunction. This was evidence of an organized system of child acquisition that used legitimate social services as a hunting ground for vulnerable victims who could be groomed, isolated, and transformed into additional wives, daughters, or servants for Jacob's twisted domestic empire. The musty smell of old filing cabinets mixed with cigarette smoke and coffee as Helen Morrison spread case files across her desk in the cramped Harlan County Social Services office, while the rhythmic clacking of typewriter keys from neighboring cubicles created a steady background noise that seemed to emphasize how routine bureaucracy had enabled extraordinary evil to operate with complete impunity. The manila folders contained documentation of crimes that should have triggered immediate investigation, but had instead been processed as normal administrative procedures. Jacob Whitmore had first approached social services in 1947, shortly after the birth of his second child with Mary Elizabeth. He had presented himself as a prosperous businessman who wanted to provide homes for girls from broken families, particularly those who had experienced trauma or abuse that made them difficult to place in traditional foster situations. His application had been approved with minimal screening, partly because rural social services were overwhelmed with cases and desperate for any families willing to take difficult placements, and partly because Jacob's reputation as a successful store owner and family man made him appear to be an ideal foster parent who could provide stability and resources that most families couldn't offer. September 12th, 1947. Mr. Whitmore appears highly motivated to provide care for troubled girls who have experienced family disruption. His household is well established, with adequate resources and strong moral foundation. Wife Mary Elizabeth demonstrates excellent domestic skills and maternal instincts that would benefit children who have lacked proper female guidance. Recommend approval for foster placement program. The social worker who had approved Jacob's application had never visited the Whitmore household or observed the family dynamics that would have revealed the true nature of Mary Elizabeth's relationship with Jacob. The evaluation had been based entirely on Jacob's self-presentation and documentation that he had carefully prepared to create the impression of a conventional family structure. Helen Morrison's investigation revealed that Jacob had been systematically targeting specific types of foster children who would be most vulnerable to his manipulation techniques. He requested girls between the ages of 8 and 14 who had experienced sexual abuse, family abandonment, or severe neglect that had left them desperate for adult approval and willing to accept almost any form of attention as evidence of love and care. These children arrived at the Whitmore household already damaged by previous trauma, making them ideal candidates for additional manipulation that could be disguised as healing, education, or family integration. Jacob had learned to identify psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited to create dependency, loyalty, and acceptance of inappropriate relationships. The first foster child, Linda Patterson, had been placed with the Whitmore family in October 1947 at age 9, following her mother's death in a car accident and her father's abandonment. Her case file showed regular check-ins with social services for the first 6 months, with reports that described her successful integration into the Whitmore household and her positive response to Mary Elizabeth's maternal guidance. But after April 1948, Linda Patterson disappeared from all official documentation. Her case file contained no records of her being returned to relatives, transferred to another placement, or aging out of the foster system. She had simply ceased to exist as far as social services was concerned, becoming another invisible member of Jacob's expanding household. Morrison discovered that the same pattern had been repeated 12 times over 11 years, with each foster placement following identical procedures: initial placement with positive reports, gradual reduction in official oversight, and eventual disappearance from all records. The Social Services Department had lost track of 12 children who had been legally placed in Jacob's custody and never officially removed from his care. The foster girls had been integrated into the Whitmore household using techniques that paralleled Jacob's original conditioning of Mary Elizabeth, but adapted for children who had already experienced trauma and abandonment. He presented himself as a rescuer who offered permanent family membership in exchange for loyalty, secrecy, and acceptance of his authority over every aspect of their lives. The children were told they were joining a special family where normal rules didn't apply because they had been chosen for higher purposes that ordinary people couldn't understand. This explanation appealed to children who had been rejected or abandoned by their original families, offering them a sense of specialness and belonging that they had never experienced before. June 3, 1952, foster placement Rebecca Davis, age 11, demonstrates excellent adjustment to Whitmore household structure. Shows strong attachment to foster mother Mary Elizabeth and appropriate respect for Mr. Whitmore's authority. Recommend continued placement with reduced supervision schedule. Innocence has no defense. The conditioning process Jacob used with foster children involved the same gradual boundary violations he had used with Mary Elizabeth, but accelerated because the children had less psychological stability and fewer reference points for normal family relationships. Their previous trauma made them more susceptible to manipulation and less likely to recognize inappropriate behavior as abusive rather than educational. Each foster child was assigned specific roles within the household hierarchy that positioned them as junior wives, domestic servants, or surrogate daughters, depending on their age, personality, and Jacob's current needs. The children were taught to compete with each other for his attention and approval, creating internal conflicts that prevented them from forming alliances that might challenge his authority. The foster children were also used to help condition new arrivals, serving as peer advocates for Jacob's system and providing testimonials about the benefits of accepting their assigned roles within the household. Children who had been successfully manipulated became recruiters and trainers for subsequent victims, perpetuating the cycle of abuse through their own testimonies about the family's special status. Morrison's investigation revealed that several of the foster children had been impregnated by Jacob once they reached adolescence, producing additional children whose parentage was deliberately obscured through paperwork that listed various women as mothers while maintaining Jacob's paternal rights. The household had become a breeding operation that produced children whose complex genetic relationships mirrored the psychological confusion that governed all aspects of family life. By 1958, the Whitmore household contained over 20 individuals whose relationships with each other defied classification, and whose legal status ranged from legitimate family members to missing persons whose disappearances had never been investigated. Jacob had created a domestic empire that operated outside normal social oversight while using legitimate institutions to acquire new victims. The most disturbing aspect of Morrison's investigation wasn't the scope of Jacob's crimes. It was the discovery that multiple social workers, teachers, and community officials had been aware of irregularities in the Whitmore household, but had chosen to ignore warning signs rather than investigate situations that might reveal systematic abuse. The conspiracy of silence that protected Jacob's operation involved people whose professional responsibilities included protecting children from exactly the kinds of abuse he was perpetrating. They had prioritized bureaucratic convenience over child welfare, allowing their administrative systems to be used as instruments of victimization rather than protection. Morrison understood that she was documenting evidence of institutional failure on a scale that challenged basic assumptions about social services, law enforcement, and community responsibility for protecting vulnerable children from predatory adults who had learned to manipulate legitimate systems for criminal purposes. But her investigation was about to reveal something that would make Jacob's crimes even more horrifying. Evidence that he had been coordinating with other men throughout Appalachian communities who were operating similar systems of family-based abuse, creating a regional network of child predators who shared victims, techniques, and legal strategies for avoiding prosecution. The correspondence found in Jacob Whitmore's personal safe revealed a network of communication that stretched across 6 Appalachian states, with letters exchanged between men who had developed similar systems of psychological manipulation and child acquisition, sharing techniques for maintaining control over expanded households while avoiding detection from law enforcement and social services. When FBI agent Patricia Collins analyzed the intercepted letters in 1961, she realized she was looking at evidence of the most sophisticated organized child abuse network in American history. Operating under the protection of rural isolation and community silence that made investigation nearly impossible. This wasn't just individual family dysfunction. This was evidence of a coordinated criminal enterprise that had systematized the process of acquiring, conditioning, and exploiting vulnerable children across multiple states while using legitimate institutions as cover for organized predatory behavior. The steady hum of fluorescent lights filled the FBI field office in Lexington as Agent Collins spread dozens of letters across conference tables, while the acrid smell of cigarette smoke mixed with coffee and the metallic taste of anxiety that accompanied investigations into crimes that exceeded normal categories of criminal behavior. Her team had been tracking reports of missing children and unusual family situations for 18 months. But the Whitmore correspondence revealed connections that transformed scattered incidents into evidence of systematic organized crime. Jacob Whitmore had been corresponding with at least 15 other men who had established similar household arrangements throughout mountain communities in Kentucky, Virginia, West Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Georgia. The letters used coded language that disguised criminal activities as discussions of farming, business, and family management, but careful analysis revealed systematic sharing of information about child acquisition, psychological conditioning, and legal protection strategies. The network had originated in the early 1940s when several men who had developed similar systems of family control began sharing techniques through correspondence initiated at religious gatherings, agricultural fairs, and business meetings that provided legitimate reasons for contact between geographically scattered individuals. What had started as informal consultation had evolved into a sophisticated criminal organization that operated with the efficiency of a commercial enterprise. The letters revealed that the network members had developed standardized procedures for identifying vulnerable children, manipulating social services placement processes, and conditioning victims to accept expanded household arrangements that violated every legal and moral boundary governing family relationships. They had essentially created a manual for systematic child abuse that could be replicated in any isolated community where law enforcement oversight was minimal. March 15th, 1959. Your recent acquisition strategies have proven highly effective in our region as well. The key appears to be establishing relationships with social workers who prioritize placement over investigation. We have found that offering to take difficult cases creates gratitude that discourages uncomfortable questions about household arrangements. The network's approach to victim acquisition had become increasingly sophisticated over time, incorporating detailed intelligence about social services operations, legal vulnerabilities, and community dynamics that could be exploited to create steady streams of vulnerable children. Members shared information about which counties had overwhelmed social services, which officials could be influenced through financial incentives, and which types of children were most likely to accept manipulation without resistance. Agent Collins discovered that the network had developed what they called training protocols that standardized the process of conditioning new arrivals to accept their assigned roles within expanded households. These protocols had been refined through years of experimentation and shared experiences, creating techniques that were both psychologically devastating and legally difficult to prosecute. The conditioning process typically began with isolation from outside influences that might provide perspective on normal family relationships or challenge the authority structure being imposed by the household patriarch. Children were taught that their previous experiences had been deficient or harmful and that their new family represented a superior form of human relationship that required different rules and expectations. Victims were gradually introduced to expanded role expectations through a combination of religious justification, practical necessity arguments, and emotional manipulation that made acceptance seem like evidence of maturity and family loyalty rather than submission to abuse. The process was designed to eliminate the victim's ability to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate relationships, while creating psychological dependency that prevented resistance or escape attempts. The network members had also developed strategies for managing legal complications that arose when their activities attracted official attention. They maintained relationships with sympathetic attorneys who specialized in family law and religious freedom cases, providing legal representation that portrayed criminal investigations as persecution of alternative lifestyle choices rather than enforcement of child protection laws. August 7th, 1960. Legal counsel suggests emphasizing religious freedom and family autonomy arguments when challenged by authorities. Courts reluctant to interfere with domestic arrangements that can be presented as traditional family values rather than criminal behavior. Key is maintaining appearance of voluntary participation by all household members. The network's legal strategies had proven remarkably effective at neutralizing law enforcement investigations and social services interventions that might have exposed their criminal activities. They had learned to exploit constitutional protections for religious freedom and family autonomy to create legal immunity for behavior that would have been prosecuted as criminal if it had occurred outside the context of family relationships. Evil organizes itself, but the network's most disturbing innovation wasn't their techniques for acquiring and conditioning victims. It was their development of systematic procedures for disposing of individuals who became problematic, either because they won half of this from resisted conditioning, or because they posed threats to the organization's security through potential testimony or evidence. The letters contained coded references to permanent solutions and final placements that had been implemented when standard conditioning techniques failed to produce acceptable results. Agent Collins's analysis suggested that the network had developed procedures for eliminating victims whose continued existence threatened the security of their operations. The disposal procedures appeared to involve coordinated efforts between multiple network members, with victims being transferred between households until they could be eliminated in locations where their disappearances would be attributed to natural causes, accidents, or voluntary departures rather than homicide. The system provided multiple layers of deniability while ensuring that no single network member bore responsibility for evidence that might trigger intensive investigation. Agent Collins realized that the network had essentially industrialized child abuse, creating procedures that allowed them to acquire, exploit, and dispose of victims with the efficiency of a commercial operation while maintaining legal protection through constitutional arguments about family autonomy and religious freedom. The scope of the network's activities suggested that hundreds of children had been victimized over nearly 2 decades of coordinated criminal enterprise, with victims drawn from multiple states and disposed of through methods that made accurate body counts impossible. The organization had achieved a level of sophistication and legal protection that made conventional law enforcement approaches inadequate for disrupting their activities. But Agent Collins' investigation was about to encounter an obstacle that would demonstrate just how deeply the network had penetrated legitimate institutions. Evidence that several federal officials, including judges, prosecutors, and social services administrators, had been compromised through financial incentives, blackmail, or ideological sympathy that made them active participants in protecting the network from legal consequences. The criminal enterprise had evolved beyond simple child abuse into a form of institutional corruption that challenged the federal government's ability to protect vulnerable children from organized predators who had learned to exploit. Every weakness in America's legal and social services systems, and when Agent Collins attempted to present her findings to federal prosecutors, she would discover that the network's influence extended into the highest levels of law enforcement, where decisions about which cases to pursue were being influenced by considerations that had nothing to do with evidence or legal merit, and everything to do with protecting powerful interests from uncomfortable revelations about systematic child abuse. The classified memorandum from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to Agent Collins, dated November 23, 1961, contained a single paragraph that effectively ended the largest child abuse investigation in federal history. Investigation into Appalachian family networks terminated due to insufficient evidence and jurisdictional complications. Agent Collins reassigned to Bank Robbery Division effective immediately. All case files classified pending national security review. What Agent Collins didn't know was that her investigation had exposed a network whose influence extended into the highest levels of federal government, where decisions about prosecution were being made by officials who had their own reasons for ensuring that certain family arrangements remained protected from legal scrutiny. This wasn't just bureaucratic obstruction. This was evidence of a coordinated cover-up that involved federal officials who were willing to sacrifice hundreds of child victims to protect a system of organized abuse that had become politically and economically valuable to powerful interests throughout the American establishment. The harsh, fluorescent lighting of FBI headquarters cast shadows across Agent Collins's desk as she packed 2 years of investigative work into boxes that would disappear into classified storage facilities, while the sound of shredding machines in neighboring offices created a mechanical rhythm that seemed to echo the systematic destruction of evidence that could have saved dozens of children from continued abuse. The smell of fresh ink on classification stamps mixed with the metallic taste of defeat as she watched her career's most important work being buried under national security restrictions that had nothing to do with protecting America, and everything to do with protecting criminals. The termination order had arrived without warning or explanation, but Agent Collins's investigation into the decision-making process revealed a pattern of political pressure that extended far beyond the FBI into congressional offices, federal judicial appointments, and executive branch agencies that had been systematically compromised by the child abuse network's expansion into legitimate institutions. The network had evolved beyond simple criminal enterprise into a form of political organization that provided valuable services to federal officials who needed discrete solutions to personal and professional problems. Members offered financial resources, political support, and specialized services that made them valuable allies for officials whose careers depended on maintaining public respectability while satisfying private needs that couldn't be met through conventional means. Several prominent federal judges had developed relationships with network members who provided household management services that helped officials maintain domestic stability while pursuing demanding careers in public service. These arrangements were presented as legitimate employment and child care services, but Agent Collins's investigation had revealed that they involved systematic provision of conditioned victims who served multiple functions within officials' households. The network had also developed expertise in handling family problems that arose when officials' children or relatives became involved in scandals that could damage political careers. They provided discrete residential facilities where problematic family members could be managed indefinitely without attracting public attention or creating legal complications for their high-profile relatives. Internal Memo, September 18, 1961. Network contacts report successful resolution of Senator M's family situation. Subject relocated to secure facility where ongoing management will ensure no public complications. Grateful appreciation expressed through continued support for judicial nominations favorable to network interests. The services provided by the network had created relationships of mutual dependency that made federal prosecution impossible without exposing the complicity of officials who had careers and reputations to protect. Any serious investigation would necessarily reveal the extent to which legitimate government had been compromised by organized child abuse, creating political scandals that could destroy multiple administrations and undermine public confidence in federal institutions. Agent Collins discovered that her investigation had been monitored from its inception by officials who were prepared to terminate it whenever it approached information that might threaten the network's high-level relationships. Her communications had been intercepted, her evidence had been copied, and her conclusions had been analyzed by people whose primary concern was protecting political allies rather than prosecuting criminals. The classified files that Agent Collins was forbidden to examine contained evidence that the network's influence extended into the Supreme Court, where decisions about family law and constitutional interpretation were being influenced by justices who had personal relationships with network members or who had benefited from services that created conflicts of interest in cases involving child welfare and family autonomy. The constitutional arguments that had proven so effective at protecting network members from state-level prosecution had been developed through coordination with federal officials who ensured that relevant legal precedents would support expanded interpretations of family autonomy and religious freedom that made traditional child protection laws increasingly difficult to enforce. Power protects power, but the most disturbing aspect of the federal cover-up wasn't the political corruption. It was evidence that the network had been integrated into intelligence operations that used their expertise in psychological manipulation and population control for purposes that extended far beyond criminal profit into national security applications that served broader government interests. The network's techniques for identifying, acquiring, and conditioning vulnerable individuals had proven valuable for intelligence agencies that needed to create assets who could be deployed for sensitive operations without risk of exposure or betrayal. The psychological conditioning methods developed for controlling children were being adapted for adult subjects who needed to be prepared for deep cover assignments or dangerous missions that required complete loyalty, psychological stability. Agent Collins's investigation had accidentally exposed a collaboration between organized child abusers and federal intelligence agencies that transformed criminal techniques into national security assets. The network members were essentially government contractors who provided specialized services that couldn't be obtained through conventional recruitment and training methods. The intelligence applications had made the network too valuable to prosecute, regardless of the humanitarian cost of allowing their criminal activities to continue. Federal officials had made a calculated decision that the strategic benefits of maintaining access to the network's expertise outweighed the moral imperative of protecting their victims from continued abuse. The cover-up had been orchestrated to protect not just individual criminals, but an entire system of government operations that depended on techniques developed through systematic child abuse. Exposing the network would necessarily expose the intelligence agencies that had been using their services, creating national security complications that officials were unwilling to accept. Agent Collins understood that she had uncovered evidence of government-sponsored child abuse on a scale that challenged basic assumptions about American institutions and democratic accountability. The same agencies that were supposed to protect children from predators had become partners with those predators in activities that served political and intelligence purposes while sacrificing vulnerable victims to maintain operational effectiveness. The termination of her investigation represented more than bureaucratic failure. It was evidence of institutional corruption so complete that the federal government had become an active participant in the crimes it was supposed to prosecute, protecting organized child abuse because it served broader political and strategic interests. But Agent Collins had made copies of her most damning evidence before the classification orders were implemented, and her private investigation would continue even after her official role had been terminated. She understood that exposing the truth about the network and its government protection would require operating outside legitimate channels that had been compromised by the same people she was investigating. Her unofficial investigation was about to reveal that the network's government connections extended beyond intelligence agencies into corporate partnerships that had commercialized their techniques for civilian applications, creating a private industry built on systematic psychological manipulation that served both criminal and legitimate business purposes, while maintaining the same patterns of abuse that had originated in isolated mountain communities. The corporate training manual discovered in the archives of Behavioral Dynamics Corporation contained psychological manipulation techniques that Agent Collins immediately recognized as refined versions of the conditioning methods Jacob Whitmore had used to transform his daughter into a compliant victim, but now packaged as advanced personnel management strategies, being sold to Fortune 500 companies seeking more effective ways to control employee behavior and eliminate workplace dissent. By 1973, the network's expertise in psychological manipulation had been commercialized into a multi-million-dollar industry that applied systematic abuse techniques to corporate environments while maintaining complete legal immunity under the guise of management, consulting, and organizational psychology. This wasn't just criminal expansion. This was evidence of how systematic child abuse had evolved into legitimate business practices that affected millions of American workers who were being subjected to the same psychological conditioning techniques that had originally been developed to control kidnapped children in isolated mountain communities. The sterile smell of corporate offices, mixed with fresh coffee and copying machine toner, as Agent Collins, now working as a private investigator, photographed documents in the executive suite of Behavioral Dynamics Corporation's Chicago headquarters, while the distant hum of air conditioning systems created a white noise backdrop that seemed to mask the psychological violence being systematically applied to unwitting corporate employees throughout America. The mahogany conference tables and leather-bound reports disguised techniques that would have been recognized as torture if they had been applied in any context other than workplace management. Behavioral Dynamics Corporation had been founded in 1968 by Dr. St. Marcus Whitmore, Jacob's eldest son, who had transformed his childhood experiences with systematic psychological manipulation into advanced degrees in industrial psychology and organizational behavior. He had essentially weaponized his trauma, converting the abuse techniques he had learned through direct experience into professional credentials that made him one of the most sought-after management consultants in American corporate history. The company's client list included major banks, manufacturing corporations, government agencies, and educational institutions that had paid millions of dollars for training programs designed to increase employee compliance while reducing turnover, union activity, and workplace resistance to management decisions. The techniques were presented as cutting-edge advances in human resource management, but they were actually refined versions of the same psychological conditioning that had been used to control victims in the Appalachian Abuse Network. Dr. Whitmore's corporate training programs incorporated elements of isolation, dependency creation, reality distortion, and authority worship that paralleled the family conditioning techniques his father had perfected decades earlier. Employees were subjected to intensive workshops that broke down their psychological resistance to corporate authority while creating emotional dependency on organizational approval and advancement opportunities. The training programs began with exercises designed to identify employees' psychological vulnerabilities, personal insecurities, and emotional needs that could be exploited to create compliance and loyalty. Participants were encouraged to share personal information about their backgrounds, relationships, and goals in ways that provided trainers with comprehensive psychological profiles that could be used to manipulate behavior. Training Protocol 7A. Establish emotional vulnerability through guided sharing exercises. Identify subjects' core insecurities, family dysfunction patterns, and dependency needs. Use information to create targeted manipulation strategies that channel personal trauma into organizational loyalty and productivity enhancement. The workshops used group dynamics and peer pressure to break down individual psychological defenses while creating artificial emotional bonds between employees and corporate leadership. Participants were taught to interpret criticism of management decisions as personal attacks on their organizational family and to view workplace conflicts as threats to their emotional security rather than legitimate business disagreements. The psychological conditioning was reinforced through ongoing workplace practices that maintained the artificial dependency relationships created during initial training sessions. Employees were subjected to regular performance counseling that used personal information gathered during training to manipulate career advancement, salary decisions, and workplace assignments in ways that maintained psychological control over their professional and personal lives. The corporate applications of abuse techniques had proven remarkably effective at increasing productivity while reducing employee complaints, union organizing activities, and turnover rates that affected corporate profitability. Companies that implemented behavioral dynamics training programs reported significant improvements in workforce compliance and organizational efficiency, making the services extremely popular among executives who prioritize control over employee welfare. But the most disturbing aspect of the corporate evolution wasn't the application of abuse techniques to workplace management. It was evidence that the training programs were being used to identify and recruit new victims for expanded abuse networks that had adapted their operations to urban environments where traditional family-based structures were less viable. Submission becomes success. Dr. Whitmore's training programs included systematic identification of employees who exhibited psychological profiles that made them suitable candidates for expanded forms of manipulation and control. Participants who demonstrated high vulnerability to authority figures, low self-esteem, and social isolation were flagged for additional development opportunities that gradually introduced them to network activities. The recruitment process typically began with invitations to exclusive social events, professional development workshops, or mentoring relationships that provided opportunities for more intensive psychological assessment and conditioning. Employees who responded positively to initial manipulation were gradually introduced to network members who could provide career advancement opportunities in exchange for participation in expanded organizational relationships. Agent Collins discovered that several major corporations had been systematically infiltrated by network members who used their professional positions to recruit new participants while providing corporate legitimacy for activities that remained fundamentally criminal despite their business applications. The network had evolved from a rural criminal organization into an urban professional conspiracy that maintained the same patterns of abuse while operating with complete legal protection. The corporate training programs had also been adapted for government agencies, educational institutions, and military organizations that needed more effective methods for controlling personnel behavior and eliminating dissent or resistance to organizational policies. The techniques were particularly popular among agencies that dealt with sensitive information or controversial policies where employee loyalty was considered essential for operational security. The adaptation of abuse techniques to legitimate institutions had created a parallel system of social control that affected millions of Americans who were subjected to systematic psychological manipulation without understanding the criminal origins of the methods being applied to their professional and personal lives. The network had achieved a level of social penetration that exceeded anything possible through traditional criminal enterprise. Agent Collins realized that her investigation had revealed how systematic child abuse could evolve into legitimate social institutions that perpetuated the same patterns of psychological violence while claiming to serve beneficial purposes. For organizational efficiency and social stability, the techniques that had originated in isolated mountain communities were now being applied throughout American society with the blessing of corporate executives, government administrators, and academic institutions that valued control over human welfare. The network had achieved ultimate success by transforming their criminal expertise into professional services that were not only legal, but highly profitable and socially respected. They had essentially legitimized systematic abuse by packaging it as advanced management science and organizational psychology. But Agent Collins's investigation was about to uncover the network's most ambitious project, evidence that they were developing techniques for mass psychological manipulation that could be applied to entire populations through media, advertising, and political campaigns, creating systems of social control that would make their previous achievements seem primitive by comparison. The same people who had perfected child abuse through family manipulation were preparing to apply those techniques to American democracy itself, using their expertise in psychological conditioning to influence elections, public opinion, and social behavior on a scale that would affect every citizen, regardless of their awareness or consent to being manipulated. The YouTube video that went viral in 2024 was titled, "My Grandmother Was Her Father's Wife, A Family's Journey Through Generational Trauma," and it featured 53-year-old Rebecca Davis Thompson sitting in her therapist's office, finally speaking publicly about growing up in a household where her grandmother, Mary Elizabeth, had simultaneously served as her great-grandfather Jacob's daughter, wife, and the mother of her own grandfather. When Rebecca's testimony triggered investigations into Behavioral Dynamics Corporation's modern operations, federal authorities discovered that the psychological manipulation techniques originally developed in Jacob Whitmore's mountain compound were now being applied to social media algorithms designed to influence political behavior, consumer choices, and social relationships affecting over 200 million Americans through platforms that had unknowingly weaponized systematic abuse methods for commercial and political purposes. This was the moment when the true scope of Jacob Whitmore's legacy became clear. His techniques for destroying individual psychological autonomy had evolved into systems of mass manipulation that threatened the foundations of democratic society itself, proving that evil, once perfected, never remains contained within its original boundaries, but spreads through every institution willing to prioritize control over human dignity. The soft lighting of the therapist's office illuminated Rebecca's face as she spoke into a handheld camera, while the sound of traffic outside mixed with her steady voice describing childhood memories that challenged viewers' understanding of family relationships and psychological trauma. Her decision to share her story publicly had been triggered by the discovery that her family's techniques for manipulation were being used by technology companies to influence millions of people who had no idea they were being subjected to refined versions of systematic psychological abuse. Rebecca Davis Thompson had been born in 1971 as the daughter of Linda Patterson, the first foster child acquired by Jacobs Network in 1947. Linda had never escaped the Whitmore household, instead becoming one of Jacobs' additional wives and bearing 3 children whose genetic relationships to other family members created genealogical puzzles that required advanced DNA analysis to untangle. Rebecca's childhood had been spent in a household where the same psychological conditioning techniques that had destroyed Mary Elizabeth's autonomy were being applied to 3rd and 4th generations of victims who had never known any other form of family relationship. She had grown up believing that confusion about identity, authority, and personal boundaries was the normal human condition rather than evidence of systematic abuse. Her escape from the family system had occurred accidentally when she was 18, during a medical emergency that required hospitalization outside the network's controlled environment. The experience of interacting with healthcare professionals who treated her as an autonomous individual rather than an extension of family authority had provided her first glimpse of normal human relationships and triggered questions about her upbringing that would require decades of therapy to fully process. The viral video had attracted attention from investigative journalists who began tracing connections between Rebecca's family history and modern corporate practices that seemed to apply similar manipulation techniques to mass audiences. Their research revealed that Behavioral Dynamics Corporation had evolved beyond workplace training to include social media consulting, political campaign management, and advertising strategy development that used sophisticated psychological manipulation to influence behavior on unprecedented scales. The company's client list now included major technology platforms, political organizations, and consumer brands that paid millions of dollars for techniques designed to create artificial dependency relationships between users and digital products or political movements. The services were marketed as engagement optimization and user experience enhancement, but they incorporated the same psychological conditioning methods that had been used to control abuse victims in isolated mountain communities. Platform Optimization Report, Q3 2024. Implementation of dependency creation protocols has increased average user engagement by 347%, while reducing platform abandonment rates to historic lows. Subjects demonstrate increased emotional investment in platform validation systems and decreased resistance to algorithmic content manipulation. The digital applications of abuse techniques had proven remarkably effective at creating compulsive usage patterns, political polarization, and consumer behavior that served corporate and political interests, while systematically undermining users' psychological autonomy and critical thinking capabilities. Social media platforms that implemented these techniques reported dramatic increases in user engagement and advertising revenue, making the services extremely popular among technology executives who prioritize profit over user welfare. Agent Collins, now in her 80s and working as a consultant for digital rights organizations, recognized the techniques being described in corporate documents as refined versions of the same methods she had investigated in the 1960s. The network had achieved its ultimate evolution by transforming systematic abuse into algorithmic systems that could manipulate millions of people simultaneously, while maintaining complete legal immunity under the guise of technological innovation and market-driven business practices. The social media applications had been designed to identify users' psychological vulnerabilities through analysis of their posting patterns, social connections, and engagement behaviors, creating detailed profiles that could be used to manipulate emotions, opinions, and purchasing decisions with unprecedented precision. The platforms essentially functioned as psychological assessment tools that generated manipulation strategies tailored to individual users' specific weaknesses and dependencies. The political applications were even more disturbing, involving systematic use of abuse techniques to create artificial polarization, emotional dependency on political leaders, and resistance to information that challenged predetermined ideological positions. Campaign consulting services used the same psychological conditioning methods that had been developed to control abuse victims to create political movements characterized by unquestioning loyalty, emotional volatility, and hostility toward external sources of information or analysis. Democracy requires autonomous minds. The investigation triggered by Rebecca's video revealed that the network's influence had extended into artificial intelligence development, where machine learning algorithms were being trained using psychological manipulation techniques that had been refined through decades of systematic human abuse. The AI systems were designed to predict and influence human behavior, with capabilities that exceeded anything possible through traditional marketing or political persuasion. The artificial intelligence applications represented the final evolution of Jacob Whitmore's legacy, transforming individual psychological manipulation into automated systems that could analyze and influence human behavior at population scales while operating with complete independence from human oversight or ethical constraints. The network had essentially created artificial predators that could systematically abuse entire societies while remaining invisible to their victims. Federal investigations into Behavioral Dynamics Corporation's modern operations revealed connections to foreign intelligence agencies, domestic political organizations, and technology companies that had been systematically using refined abuse techniques to influence American elections, consumer behavior, and social relationships for over a decade. The network had evolved from a criminal conspiracy into a form of technological warfare that threatened the psychological foundations of democratic society. But the most disturbing discovery wasn't the scope of the network's modern influence. It was evidence that the techniques were being actively taught to new generations of technology developers, political operatives, and corporate executives who were learning to apply systematic psychological abuse without understanding its criminal origins or recognizing its humanitarian consequences. The network had achieved immortality by transforming their expertise into educational curricula, professional training programs, and technological systems that would continue operating long after the original perpetrators had died. They had essentially programmed systematic abuse into the infrastructure of modern society, ensuring that their techniques would continue affecting future generations regardless of whether anyone remembered their criminal origins. Rebecca Davis Thompson's decision to speak publicly about her family's history had exposed how evil could evolve from individual crimes into institutional systems that affected entire societies while maintaining complete legal protection through technological and corporate legitimacy. Her courage in breaking generational silence had revealed that the battle against systematic abuse required not just individual healing, but collective recognition of how criminal techniques could be disguised as legitimate business practices and technological innovation. The investigation continued as federal authorities struggled to address crimes that had been woven into the fabric of American institutions so completely that prosecution would require dismantling systems that affected millions of people's daily lives, while challenging corporate and political interests with the resources to protect themselves from accountability. They say that if you look carefully at the terms of service agreements for major social media platforms, you can still find language that gives companies permission to analyze and manipulate user behavior in ways that mirror the psychological conditioning techniques Jacob Whitmore developed in his isolated mountain compound over 80 years ago. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.